Hello, everyone. We are going to start, as people continue to come in, with a short video about nutrition programs in rural Guatemala. So I'll play that, and then we'll come back together in about 2 minutes.
Yo soy enfermera auxiliar y también pertenezco al grupo de cocodres de esta comunidad. Trabajo con Timi para la jornada, para la nutrición. Yo soy la facilitadora, que soy parte de jornada con estos proyectos que tiene 32 volcanes y Timi también. Cuando hay niños desnutridos, en primer lugar, no tienen buen desarrollo, no crecen, no viven felices porque siempre están enfermos. También afecta cuando ya van a la escuela, porque ya tienen problemas para leer o para escribir, pero cuando un niño está bien nutrido, es un niño sano, feliz y también inteligente. Yo tengo el ejemplo de mi hijo, que estuvo en el programa de nutrición y eso le ha ayudado bastante en la escuela. Ha tenido sus calificaciones muy altas, por eso yo estoy muy feliz y agradecido con Dios por este programa, porque anteriormente casi no había programas, pero ahora ha ayudado con la entrega de suplementos, con la incaparina, con los huevos. Ya eso es una ayuda bastante para la familia, porque como algunos están en desnutrición y con mala atención, a veces en el hospital y no hay mucha atención, o a veces no te atienden bien o nada más dejan la receta, pero ¿qué hace uno? A veces uno tiene que prestar dinero para comprar la medicina, porque no hay medicina. Pues a veces he visitado hospital, pero nada más dejan receta, tengo que comprarle medicina.
All right, welcome everyone. That was a video about a nutrition program in rural Guatemala featuring Doña Luisa, a nurse and community leader who we'll hear more from later. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about migration and its relationship with organized crime. I'm going to present with a PowerPoint and also play some video interviews that I did in Guatemala recently for about 40 minutes, and then open it up to questions, which I'll take through the chat function. I'll leave my PowerPoint in this mode instead of presentation mode to switch between the videos. And FYI, you are muted. Feel free to follow along with or without your video activated. I'll also send a resource packet along over the next few days with links to articles and videos on each of the topics that we'll be covering today. So this is a Dragons Global Speaker Series presentation. Every year, Dragons sends its instructors like me to give presentations on their areas of expertise. We speak in conferences and high schools all over the country. Dragons has been around since '93, taking high school and college students and other adults as far off the beaten path in Asia and Africa and Latin America as we can. And we immerse students in everyday life in the places we visit, focusing on sustainable development and comparative religion and language studies and responsible travel. And we explore how our host communities face some really tough situations with very creative and innovative development projects. I've led 3 of the summer courses in Guatemala, and once in a while I interact with these semester courses to introduce students to some of the most inspiring communities that I've been lucky enough to work with as a reporter based in Guatemala since 2013. I lived for 3 years in this beautiful city of Quetzaltenango and 2 years in the Maya Zutujil town of San Juan La Laguna on famous Lake Atitlan. And I deliver a global speaker series generally on the drivers of migration from Guatemala and Honduras, and land and water conflict, as well as the political crises over the last few years in both of those countries, because that's what I've mostly been covering. And I focus in my talks on Guatemala and Honduras, which you see in the map there below Mexico, because that's where most of the people who are coming to our border are coming from. Those two countries, Guatemala and Honduras, send far more people to our southern border than any other country, over 200,000 people a year in some cases. This relationship between organized crime and migration is something that's come up again and again in my reporting over the past year, even though I was focused on other topics. I facilitate the Dragons Forum on Migration, in which I connect students through video interviews with migrating families and civil society leaders and politicians in Guatemala and Mexico. And many of the people I've sat down with recently have talked to me about the fact that many Guatemalans are dying or going missing every year on their way to the US. So first, I'll give you a little bit of background on Guatemala, and then we'll hear from some of those people who have been talking about this problem. So again, there's Guatemala and Honduras below Mexico. Guatemala, of course, is famous for its ancient Maya culture. This is Tikal. Around 700 AD, it reached its apogee, its height. That's a big pyramid, not the biggest pyramid on Earth, of course. This is the biggest pyramid in the world. It's buried in the jungle in northern Guatemala. It's partially excavated, and it's from 300 to 500 BC. If it were fully excavated, that's how big it would look compared to those puny Egyptian pyramids. And Maya culture is still alive and well today. In fact, half of Guatemala, maybe 8 million people, speak a Native American Maya language. And I was in a Maya town called San Juan Ostuncalco in Maya Mam. That means cave home. And I was interviewing Doña Luisa, who you saw earlier, about the nutrition programs that she runs. And she ended up telling me that her nephew, unfortunately, disappeared on his way to the United States in 2011. And just 3 weeks before I spoke to her on Thanksgiving Day this past year, just 3 weeks before that, they'd gotten his body back after many years. I interviewed this man, Eduardo, who has helped to set up a school and a cooperative and a job creation program in his town, in his Maya Mam town. And as a community leader, he actually told me that every year he helps families repatriate the remains of people who have gone to the States and unfortunately have died on the way. And he does that for about one person every year he has to bring back. In the city, again, of Quetzaltenango, I was interviewing Patricio, this man, who is the plumber at my friend's bar. And he told me that several years ago on the way to the States, he was kidnapped by the Zeta drug cartel and held for ransom and barely survived. And unfortunately, a couple years ago, he asked me for help because his neighbor, Werner Sanchez, who was 17, had tried to go to the States, but hadn't been heard from since he tried to cross the Sonora Desert. So his mom was really worried. So I put Patricio in touch with organizations in the States that look for people who have disappeared in morgues and in jails in the States, but Werner was never found. He never turned up. So it looks like he died of exposure or dehydration in the Sonora Desert. This past fall, in this mountain town on the border with Mexico, still in Guatemala, I even saw a play put on by young people for the entire town about kids their age, teenagers, trying to get to the US, and the main character, a female teenager, ends up passing away on that journey. So it was clear that this was an important topic, even though I wasn't reading much about the death or disappearances of migrants on the way to the States. At a land rights protest in Guatemala City, I was speaking to this Congressman Leocadio Huracan, who took me to a conference of Guatemala's National Migration Council. This is the director. And there I got to interview this director, as well as people who have lost loved ones, who've lost kids or siblings, and now try to help other families going through that in the process of finding them and bringing their bodies home. So let's hear from some of them. I'm going to play some videos. I'm going to start with Doña Luisa, the woman who runs nutrition clinics in Guatemala.
¿Siente también la discriminación o el racismo aquí en Guatemala?
Siempre, pero más que todo donde me da tristeza es con los muchachos cuando viajan a los Estados Unidos, cuando tienen que emigrar, cuando van en el desierto, porque ellos corren riesgo, ellos dan sus vidas. Llegan o no llegan, se van. Tengo un caso de un sobrino que fue y se quedó en México, se murió. A mí me da lástima porque hace 3 semanas lo enterramos y se murió en México. Eso es lo que me da tristeza porque la gente son malos y ellos no hacen nada. Ellos no son ladrones, lo que ellos buscan es el sueño americano, para que tengan mejor vida, para que sean prosperados, para ayudar a la familia. Pero
¿siente que la comunidad se está mejorando?
sí, gracias a Dios que se está mejorando y hay buen cambio. Es por lo mismo de la remesa y gracias a Dios por la familia que han luchado y han logrado de llegar allá sin ninguna novedad. Porque perder una familia es triste, es triste.
So there, Doña Luisa at the end speaks about how remittances or money that people who are working in the US are sending back to their families in Guatemala, that money is really what's helping her community to improve. This is Baudilio Castillo. He is on the board of directors of that organization who helps people find their loved ones who have gone missing in Mexico or US deserts. And his son was a victim of organized crime of a drug cartel in Mexico in 2011, when the world really was shocked to find out when we found mass graves near the border with the US that drug cartels were kidnapping migrants en masse and sometimes executing them dozens at a time if they refuse to pay ransom or to work as lookouts or smugglers for the cartel.
Me involucré en esta organización, una vez por mi caso de mi hijo que fue masacrado en la costa de San Fernando en 2011. Me tomaron el ADN a mí y a mi señora aquí en la embajada, los de unos medios forenses argentinos, ¿verdad? Y para marzo del 2017 me dieron la noticia, me mandaron un dictamen que lo habían encontrado. Cuando yo recibí el cuerpo y recibí la noticia, cómo los bajaron del bus, cómo lo torturaron, cómo lo secuestraron, cómo le quebraron la cabeza. A él le quebraron aquí, miren, le quebraron aquí, le quebraron aquí, le quebraron aquí la cabeza. Y ahí sí, miren, nos dieron un golpe duro en el corazón. Sentimos que nos quitaron un pedazo del corazón, a mí y a mi familia, nos hicieron un daño. Y sin hacer nada, la enviaron incluso.
¿Vecinos que no se vayan a Estados Unidos?
Sí, les digo, pero la gente siempre va. ¿Por qué? Porque no han visto y la misma necesidad, ¿verdad? Que en cambio con esas remesas tal vez no ayudan a toda la comunidad, pero ayudan a sus familias a que coman bien, a que se vistan bien, a que estudien, tienen posibilidades.
So again, at the end, what Baudilio says, even though he tells his neighbors that he lost his son, and that they shouldn't try to make it to the US because it's so dangerous, that people go in order to be able to send money back for basic things, for food. Guatemala has one of the highest rates in the world of chronic malnutrition in kids. School supplies, to be able to afford basic supplies to keep kids in school, clothes. Sometimes building a home is something I hear a lot that doesn't leak during the rainy season, causing medical problems. So after speaking with Baudilio and other people like him, I sat down with Julia Gonzalez, who is the director of the Guatemalan National Council on Migration, to ask her how many people do in fact die or disappear from Guatemala on their way to the United States every year. And what she told me really shocked me.
¿Se puede estimar cuántas personas más o menos mueren camino a Estados Unidos de Guatemala cada año? Sé que es muy difícil, pero no.
No hay datos, es parte de los problemas. No llevan documentos, no están identificados, son denominados como XX.
Diría que anda en los cientos, podría ser más alto.
Yo estoy segura que es más alto. O sea, solo los cuerpos identificados en las masacres de Tamaulipas y Cadereyta son más de 700. Y México es una fosa, todo México es una fosa. O sea, hay más de 2,000 fosas encontradas, más el otro montón que todavía no se sabe. Por supuesto que hay personas mexicanas, pero también muchos migrantes, sobre todo centroamericanos. La morgue de Pima, en Arizona, tiene cantidad de cuerpos, más de 1,000 cuerpos, congelados como XX que no han sido identificados. Entonces sí es masiva la migración. El tema es que no se paran ni siquiera con estas políticas antimigratorias, que al final lo que hacen es poner en mayor situación de vulnerabilidad a los más vulnerables. O sea, cada vez más se ven forzados a desplazarse por rutas más controladas por los narcos, por el crimen organizado, por los cárteles, ¿verdad? La ruta del Golfo es de las rutas más peligrosas que existen para transitar por México, ¿verdad? Y más arriba el cártel de Sinaloa.
So there, Julia Gonzalez is saying that it is likely thousands of people every year, either in U.S. deserts or at the hands, generally, of organized crime in Mexico that go missing. And that migrants are increasingly forced to cross territory controlled by organized crime to avoid law enforcement, who are trying to prevent people from migrating. And that's something we'll come back to. Years ago, to cross territory controlled by organized crime, the migrants, with their guide, with their coyote, had to pay to be able to cross through. But more recently, things have become more complicated. This is what Julia González said about that.
Evidentemente, si la mayor población que sigue desplazándose de manera irregular son poblaciones de los pueblos mayas y del área rural, hay mayor riesgo de que aumente dentro de estas poblaciones los datos de las personas que han desaparecido. Sabemos de las diferentes causas de desaparición. El tema de la trata, el señor cónsul lo conocerá con mucho más detalle que nosotros en México, la explotación laboral y la explotación sexual. Yo hace varios años hice un estudio en el que entrevisté coyotes y me dijeron, los coyotes en ese estudio, en estas entrevistas, que antes tenían que dejar el crimen organizado en México efectivo, que ahora también dejaban seres humanos. Como pago para poder seguir el viaje.
So that information really was shocking to me, that people are increasingly not only being kidnapped by organized crime, but are being turned over to organized crime by guides, by coyotes, to allow the rest of the people trying to migrate to get through these areas. So the people trying to make this very, very dangerous, very long journey from Honduras and Guatemala all the way through Mexico to the United States are doing so cognizant of these dangers. So I think it's important to give you a little bit of an idea of why people are fleeing Guatemala and Honduras. Because if you want to understand why so many people are coming to our border, again, it's important to understand what's happening specifically in Guatemala and in Honduras, the two countries that send more people to our border than any other country. So in Guatemala, again, majority Maya country, a majority Native American country where not only language, but culture and philosophy is very much alive, which is very impressive because for 500 years, centuries, there have been generally European or European descended people in power who have done what they can to destroy Maya culture and take as much Maya land as possible. Now this goes all the way back to the Spanish colony, burning as many books as they could find, burning thousands and thousands of books on art, science, medicine, anything they could find. And one of the most interesting things about Guatemala is how these communities have held on to these symbols, even though outside forces wanted to try to destroy them. So a lot of weavers in Guatemala weave incredibly ornate clothing, which you can see on Yemi there, that contain a lot of the patterns and symbols, right, of these ancient texts. A lot of the weavers call what they weave the books that the Spanish couldn't burn. This is a community in northern Guatemala that we visit with Dragon students, and they are quite inspiring because they've used these incredible patterns that they weave, you can see on their clothing, to start a cooperative. And they sold their clothing initially in their own region, and with the help of foreign volunteers, they've now been able to sell in Europe and in the United States. And with that, they've been able to keep their kids in school, which is a real feat. Make sure they're well fed, which is a real feat in that part of the country. And it's even more inspiring and impressive because the founders of this cooperative were widowed during the genocide that took place in Guatemala in the early 1980s. And so Guatemala is full of these communities who are very creatively overcoming some pretty tough circumstances. And this discrimination against the Maya majority didn't only have to do with violence and cultural destruction, but again, taking land. So today, 5% of the population of Guatemala, very few people, control 80% of the country's arable land. And they make lots of money off of this land. It's used to grow crops for export, bananas, sugarcane, rubber. So most of the wealth from this land goes to a small number of Guatemalans who own most of it, as well as foreign businesses like Dole and Chiquita. Meanwhile, half of kids under 6 are chronically malnourished, and that's one of the top 6 rates in the world, alongside Afghanistan and Yemen. And in the countryside, not only are people running out of land, but they're running out of water. So in these big plantations, they use a great deal of water. I've even seen this pump. I'll send you the link to the video. This pump is sucking so much water out of this river that the river, instead of running downstream to the ocean, inches upstream toward the pump. The pump reversed the river's flow to water the crops of the plantation. And so farmers like Caterino Lopez tell me that their water tables are dropping. The crops that they used to be able to grow on their small plots of land aren't coming through. And that means they're taking their kids out of school, or they're trying to migrate to Guatemala City, or leaving the country. Now we know when there's more rain in Central America, there's less migration, right? And unfortunately, Guatemala and Honduras have recently gone through some pretty serious droughts linked to climate change. Droughts are becoming more and more common. In 2015, the UN estimated that 1.5 million people in Guatemala needed emergency food aid. So climate change is exacerbating existing inequalities in access to land and access to water. And that's a major flashpoint in the countryside. And that means a lot of people are going to Guatemala City, which is a very modern city, but has an increasing number of people in shanty towns coming from the countryside. Over the past 50 years, people have gone to Guatemala City and lived in informal communities or shanty towns. Meanwhile, there on the right, you have a news article from January where a $250,000 Ferrari got in a traffic accident. So in Guatemala City, you have these sprawling shanty towns as well as Ferraris and Lamborghinis driving around. In Honduras, right, over 60% of the population lives in poverty. Most kids don't even get to middle school. And yet, just like Guatemala, Honduras is a wealthy country, right? The Carnegie Endowment, they've put out various reports about the strength of the Honduran banking sector. They make lots of money in energy production, hydroelectric dams, fast food, agribusiness, clothing, phone companies. But most of the wealth generated from these industries is concentrated in the hands of about a dozen families and international agribusiness companies, clothing companies, etc. So Guatemala and Honduras are wealthy countries defined by extreme wealth inequality and corruption, lack of access to basic service like education and medical care, a lack of access to land and water in the countryside, which is forcing people into urban slums. And when you have all of these factors together, these are social factors that often lead to widespread gang violence. Unfortunately, the governments of Guatemala and Honduras have done a poor job of tackling poverty. These governments don't seem to be interested in lowering poverty or taking on corruption in a meaningful way. And so many people in Guatemala and Honduras, like Eduardo, like Julia, like Leocadio, they emphasize that it's really important for American audiences to understand that the US government over the past 5 years, as over the past 50 years, has generally supported governments in Guatemala and El Salvador that have not reduced poverty and that don't try to tackle corruption. And that the US government often opposes local governments that are trying to reform things and are trying to lower poverty. That's a topic that deserves its own in-depth discussion. but it's a matter of historical record that the United States has supported in Guatemala, for example, unfortunately, the regimes that were responsible for that genocide. So these conditions, right, lead to gang violence, and I want to give you an idea of what that feels like on the individual level. This is Gabi. She runs an organic salad shop in Quetzaltenango, this beautiful city, and she makes salads that are more delicious and more filling than I thought salads could be. And she unfortunately got extorted. And when people are fleeing these countries because of gang violence, generally it has to do with extortion. And what that means is somebody called her up and said, Gabi, I know your name, I have your phone number, I know where you live, I know what you're wearing, I see you have a business. If you don't leave me $200 every week on the park bench, I'm gonna kill you. So Gabi decided not to pay. She said, I'm gonna call the police. My business doesn't make enough to pay this anyway. And luckily, right, it wasn't somebody who was serious about that threat that had called her up. But a lot of times the people who call are serious. This is Juan Carlos. I spoke to him and lots of other people when I was embedded with the Honduras migrant caravan in 2018. And he told me a story that I heard different versions of over and over again, unfortunately, where he and his two brothers were successful mechanics. They had their own auto body shop. They were doing well, but they got that phone call. They got extorted. And they couldn't pay the extortion, and his two brothers were killed. And he told me, now I'm my mother's only son, and I'm trying to escape. So that's why he was trying to get to the States. This is Kayla, another person whose life was threatened by the gangs. I will send you links to their full stories. But you know, a lot of people told me, we're working, but we can't afford to keep our kids in school. And if they're not in school, we're terrified that the gangs are gonna try to recruit them, because local street gangs, if they see a teenager not in school, they'll go up to him and say, hey, come work for us, come be a lookout, come stand on that corner. And if you don't, we're gonna hurt you and your family. So these threats are really are real. So everybody coming to the States has their own unique story for why. But generally, when it comes to gang violence in the urban centers in the cities, it's because of this, because of extortion and really serious, credible threats on people's lives. A lot of people coming from the countryside, like this woman, have their lives threatened because big landowners are trying to kick them off their land. That happens too. And in the rural areas like in Guatemala, which are safe, people know that they're just not getting the kids the nutrition they need. And they know their kids don't have a shot at a decent diet or to stay in school. So some people come for that reason as well. And when people come to the US, they come generally to work. To give you an idea of how important this money is to Guatemala and Honduras, in terms of GDP, the money sent by people working in the States back to Guatemala, back to their families, is roughly like 12% of the country's entire GDP. In Honduras, it's over 19%, about a fifth. GDP is a complicated indicator, but this gives you an idea that this money coming from people working in the States is propping up these economies that are barely functional as it is. And again, so many people tell me it's spent on food for kids, education, clothes, and often building a safer home. And that creates tons of jobs. That's Don Cristobal from Todos Santos on the right, and he builds houses in his town, even though he's not in the States. He builds houses for people who are in the States. So he's employed because of these remittances. That's a very common situation. And we know study after study has shown that undocumented immigrants in the US are less likely to commit crime than American citizens. And that more undocumented immigration does not bring more crime, as an aside. That's not to say there aren't serious problems because of immigration. There are valid debates on all sides. There are valid views on all sides of this debate. but we are going to talk now about how the US has handled immigration. We're going to talk about the strategy. And the strategy of US immigration policy, and this is key to understand why people are now ending up in the hands of organized crime, is deterrence. Deterrence is the guiding principle of US immigration policy. The idea is to make it as difficult as people to cross the US border without permission as possible. Now, this is logical. In the late 90s, over 1 million people were being detained every year trying to cross the border. We might have about that number right now as well. And so in the 90s, this system was put in place that was, in some areas, very effective. Deterrence. Putting up walls and deploying border patrol to the most transited routes, right? The urban places, places near cities, the places where it was easy for people to get across, to cross the desert or cross the road into the United States. And so this document is available, it's public now, the strategic plan for the Border Patrol, and this is the foundational document for the policy of deterrence. And it assumes that, yes, people coming to the States will adjust. Instead of taking the easier routes that are now blocked, they'll take the more dangerous and more remote routes. They also predict that this will increase violence on the border because migrants will now have to interact with drug smugglers taking the same really remote routes. And Border Patrol was right. Their indicators of success included, right, more violence where people are trying to enter, and that migrants will have to pay much more to guides to get them over the border. We'll talk about that in a second. So the effects of deterrence are clear. More law enforcement, armed law enforcement officers on the border, and this means people take more remote and more dangerous routes where they're less likely to run into law enforcement, but more likely to try to cross some of the most dangerous deserts on Earth. This also means that migrants trying to cross the border are going to have to contract guides, coyotes, smugglers, to get them across, because you have to know exactly how to cross that desert. And so deterrence has raised the price that people have to pay for that guiding because it's more dangerous. So people pay $1,600 just at the border today, sometimes more, to cross. And that increased profit for the guides attracted the attention of organized crime. And we'll talk about that in the next section. Today, just in Pima County alone, we find over 100 bodies a year. And those are just the ones we find, like Patricio's neighbor, Werner, he wasn't found. This is in one county in Arizona, in the Sonora Desert. And so deterrence is logical, right? Try to make it as hard as possible for people to get across. But this is one of the side effects. Now, deterrence didn't only occur on the border, it occurred throughout Mexico because the US started to pay tens of millions of dollars to Mexican law enforcement, the Mexican military, to try to track down migrants in Mexico before they even get to the US border, right? So now the Mexican police and military had an incentive to go look for people who are crossing Mexico without permission. People coming from Guatemala and Honduras are crossing Mexico and they're undocumented, just like they would be in the States. So this means that Central Americans decide we have to avoid law enforcement because they'll deport us and we won't be able to get to the States. So we're gonna have to take routes where there's not a lot of law enforcement, which means routes generally controlled by organized crime. So in summary, deterrence in Mexico meant that just as deterrence on the border pushed people through the most dangerous parts of the desert, enforcement and deterrence in Mexico meant that people took routes controlled by organized crime. And because Central Americans want to avoid Mexican police, they can't ask them for help when they're robbed or assaulted, right? They can't go to the police because the police will just say, well, you're here illegally anyway. So now this is the last part of this presentation, and then we'll open it up to questions over the chat function. This is when deterrence meets the Mexican drug war. In 2006, Mexico started to change dramatically. The Mexican president declared a war on drug cartels. And we have all of these series like Narcos and all of the other ones that tell parts of this story. And the idea is this president said, well, we're going to use help from the United States, and our law enforcement is going to kill or capture as many leaders of these drug cartels as possible. And they were successful. But what happened when these 8, 9 major cartels that were well organized, they were national organizations, right? They were bringing in billions and billions of dollars a year. These drug traffickers had very sophisticated ways of taking drugs through Mexico into the US, making billions of dollars a year and buying tons of weapons from the States. What happened when the leaders were killed or captured was that the big cartels split into smaller and more violent organizations. Murder rate doubled. These smaller organizations started not only fighting each other, but it was harder for these smaller organizations to actually smuggle the drugs across the border. So they started getting involved in kidnapping and abduction for revenue. This is the Congressional Research Service has a report that it put out in 2019, and it said the fragmentation of the bigger organizations led to more violence, smaller, more violent organizations, and these organizations were more likely to try to kidnap people and prey on migrants. And so this change in the mid-2000s is what led to 2011. Criminal groups in Mexico, the UN estimates, kidnap more than 20,000 migrants every year, force them into labor or sex trafficking. People like Patricio have to pay ransoms. His mom managed to pay, borrowed from a bank, and this was 8 years ago, and he's still trying to pay this back. So this is a perfect storm. Deterrence forces people to take more dangerous routes. The Mexican drug war created more violent criminal gangs who were more likely to kidnap and abduct people. And the border became one of the most dangerous places in the world. These cities, Ciudad Juárez, Nuevo Laredo, Tijuana, Reynosa, are among the 10 most violent cities in the world. And to wrap up, this brings us to the 2018 migrant caravan. The idea of the migrant caravan was for all these people who would normally travel illegally, the idea was for them to travel together, out in the open, receive help from church groups, receive help from the police if anybody tried to rob them. So the caravan was saying, we want to come legally. We don't want to hide in the shadows because 20,000 people a year are getting kidnapped and many more are dying along the way. And so I'll send you some of the individual stories, right, of the people in the caravan. In the end, not only did they want to get to the US border without hiding in the shadows, they wanted to apply for asylum in the States. They wanted to be in the States legally, not have to try to cross the desert and risk their lives that way. So that's what is driving this asylum process. People are facing the same severe situations in their home countries, but they don't want to try to enter the US without permission. And they don't want to have to cross Mexico without permission. And generally, over the last 70 or 80 years, it's been the law that people have a right to try to ask for asylum in the United States. But now deterrence is being used against asylum seekers too, against people who want to go through the legal process. So what's happening is usually people would apply for asylum. They turn themselves into a border guard, say, I don't want to try to come in illegally. I want to prove in a US court of law that my life is in danger back home. Kayla, for example, she has a police report to document some of what happened to her, to try to prove that her life was in danger so that she can get asylum in the States. Now, these cases take months or years, and now instead of waiting in the US, Kayla has to wait in a place like Matamoros, in these cities on the border that are among the most dangerous in the world. For example, the US, we've sent about 25,000 asylum seekers to wait in Nuevo Laredo and Matamoros, in the same border state where those massacres in 2011 took place. The State Department on its website gives this area a level 4 do not travel advisory, the same advisory given to Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. Right? The State Department tells US citizens not to go to these cities because, quote, organized crime activity, gun battles, murder, armed robbery, carjacking, kidnapping, forced disappearances, extortion, sexual assault is common. So that's where these asylum seekers are being made to wait now, and it's having serious consequences. And I recently got back from Matamoros, and I talked to a local journalist, right? I was going to do interviews in these camps, but then coronavirus happened and I had to postpone it. She told me some things that really surprised me. She told me that if I go into the camps with international groups and I start asking questions, organized crime is going to know, right? Organized crime pays people from the camps to tell them what journalists are poking around about. And the second that journalists start asking about things like kidnapping, human smuggling, these increasingly common phenomena, well, the gangs, the organized crime knows about it. So that was very interesting and disturbing to me that she said that organized crime is already present in the camps, they pay informers, and that it's really hard to find out if people have been kidnapped because they're not allowed to talk about it. She even told me she was working with an international film crew from National Geographic. They told her they weren't going to ask about these things, but they did anyway. And she was their, local fixer, was translating and hooking them up with interviews. And the day after that crew left, they did actually do interviews about kidnapping. And Adira, this local journalist, woke up and both of her front doors were open as well as her back door. And so clearly, organized crime had broken into her house and left a warning saying, listen, you're not safe and you can't allow people to be asking these kinds of questions. So those are the circumstances that people are being forced to wait in. And it seems likely that if things don't improve in Guatemala and Honduras, then people are going to give up on the asylum process and are going to try to enter the US through the dangerous deserts and are now going to have to cross Mexico, not in caravans, but again, in the shadows. So I'd like to open it up to questions. These are all very complex topics, and I'll send resources. There are valid sides on all sides of the debates on these topics. But if you have questions, I'm very happy to try to answer as many as you'd like. You can use the chat function by the main menu to put in some questions. I see, what kind of border policy do you endorse? Do you think deterrence should cease? Well, it's hard to say, right? Deterrence is logical. It's often effective. But what you get is circumstances like these. I'm going to share my screen. There are organizations in the States that leave water along the routes that migrants tend to run out of water and die in the elements, right? So we know where those routes are, and some organizations leave water there. This video was released by the groups No More Deaths recently. So this is the logic of deterrence, right? Making it as difficult as possible for people to cross, destroying the water drops, trying to stop people from offering humanitarian aid. So I would say we have to focus on trying to make conditions in Guatemala and Honduras much more livable. U.S. policy needs to focus on anti-poverty and anti-corruption efforts and nothing else. And the deterrence along the border is simply killing too many people for us to continue with the status quo, in my opinion, because we're talking about thousands of people a year just from Guatemala. All right, so I'm getting a lot of questions. There's lots of hope on these issues. There are so many people, I see a question, is there any hope on these issues? There's so many people like Eduardo, right? Creating jobs in Guatemala, like Leocadio fighting for more humane policies in Guatemala, like these women who have overcome so much to create jobs in their own community. There are so many ways to plug in with these groups. So I do see a lot of hope, but a lot of it hinges on US foreign policy as well. So how did I get into journalism, and specifically the topic of organized crime? I did so on accident. I went down to Guatemala in 2013 to spend a few months there to learn Spanish, to get my Spanish down, because I'd taken French all through high school and college. My mom wanted me to, but I jumped ship from French my last year in college, took Spanish 1, and I've never been happier. And I started translating for a human rights magazine in Guatemala. And instead of leaving after a few months, I stayed, because through this magazine and through journalism, I got to meet extremely inspiring people and be in the same room with people doing incredible work. So that's what sort of guided me into journalism, is that it allows me to meet very, very, very inspiring people. So which route is safest for people to cross? It's hard to say, but it's only safe if people are allowed to cross, right? Because if they're not, they won't want to ask the police for protection. That's in Mexico. Deterrence has cut off all the easy places to cross, so almost everybody people can cross is quite dangerous. I see a question, how do migrants find and contact coyotes? So those are guides, and there are a couple of different ways. So looking at this map, right, people usually go with somebody from their own village in Guatemala, and they hire them and they pay $5,000, $7,000, $8,000 to that person to take them all the way up to the border. But the border is such a dangerous area, one of the most dangerous areas in the world, that at the border, they have to pay another guide, right, a specialist to take them across. And what happened in Patricio's case, I will show you, is that his guide did not pay the Zeta drug cartel the cut that the guide was supposed to. Patricio didn't know that. But since his guide didn't pay the drug traffickers just kidnapped all of them and demanded a ransom. So usually people go by word of mouth with coyotes and guides. Some are very honorable and do their best and do everything they can, and others do take advantage of the people that put their trust in them. So finding and contacting coyotes, generally people do it through word of mouth. Yes, okay. If so many people are trying to enter the US illegally, why don't they just enter legally? Our visa issuing system, generally, we allow people to come to the United States to work or for a visit or to study. We give legal permission, we give visas, if they can prove two things. And this is logical. We don't want, the government's position is we don't want people working in the States without permission. So when they're screening people, who can come in and who can't, they're trying to figure out who's likely to work in the States and who isn't. Who's likely to try to work illegally and who is not. And to prove that you're not likely to work illegally, you show that you have a good job and a fat bank account. So the way we issue visas is very much class-based, and people who are very poor, who clearly want to work, are generally not let in. That being said, we have guest worker programs that have been cut. If I could do anything on the US side, I think it would be to offer more guest worker positions, because most people who come, a lot of people who come to the States, right, do not want to stay forever. They want to save enough money to build a safer house for their family or move their family out of a dangerous neighborhood in Honduras. So I think there's a lot of potential for a program that allows people to work in the States temporarily, save up enough money to give their families a future back home, and then let them go back. I know, let's see. Who finances the nutrition program that was highlighted in the opening video? The nutrition program where Doña Luisa works in her community is financed by a couple of American organizations and Guatemalan organizations. The American organization is based in Indiana, and the Guatemalan organization is based in Xela, in the city that I lived in. So that's just one example of how Guatemalans are doing really wonderful work, and if there are Americans who are able to support them, that money goes a very long way. So that's another reason I find lots of hope in this situation, because people in Guatemala are extremely resourceful, just like people all over the world. And I am constantly impressed by the initiatives that are happening on the ground. And I'm also impressed by people in the States who are able to fundraise and support those initiatives. So that nutrition program is a good example of that kind of partnership. Given the situation, do you think traditional Maya culture and language will survive? I have no doubt that it will survive. Some of these 22 languages are very endangered, but the main languages will certainly survive. When I'm asking organizers in Guatemala who are risking their lives, right, to prevent a big plantation from taking their land, for example, I ask them, how can you justify risking your life for this? And people tell me, listen, my grandfather was in this fight, his grandfather and his grandfather. We've been in this fight for hundreds of years against long odds. And if you think we're going to give up now, you have to re-examine your understanding of history. That people in Guatemala, when they go out and protest and block a road or try to prevent a plantation from taking their land, they're acting with several hundred years of history in mind. So I have no doubt that Maya culture will continue to survive. The question is, some of the smaller languages and some of the smaller villages are indeed disappearing because of displacement and because of cultural pressure. I see, once the coronavirus is settled, how safe is it for me to travel or go to Guatemala? Very safe. We covered a lot of tough topics, right, in this webinar. I'm knocking on wood. I've been there for over 6 years, and I've never been robbed or assaulted. Guatemala is much safer for foreigners than for locals, right? If a foreigner gets robbed, the police are actually going to investigate. So rural Guatemala especially is very safe. That's why Dragons is able to travel there. In the rural areas, right, the poverty is the real issue. It's not gang violence, which is concentrated in the capital, right? So Guatemala is a beautiful country. You can't turn around without seeing something spectacularly beautiful and learning a lot. So I highly recommend Guatemala, and it is a safe country to travel in the rural areas. How do you keep the team safe in Guatemala? Well, we know the communities that we're traveling in. Dragons is unique because Dragons never hires people straight out of college. I was hired by Dragons after already working as a journalist in Guatemala for 3 years with an organization called Entre Mundos. I also write for other outlets. So Dragons hires very experienced guides who know the situation on the ground. We know when it's safe to travel, and we know how to react if a natural disaster happens or anything else happens. We know exactly how to react, where we can go safely. So that's really how we keep our team safe, because we have years and years and years of experience in country. Always somebody from the country is one of the 3 Dragons instructors. So generally, we're already living there. Let's see. What can we do in the United States to help the migrants and influence U.S. policy? There's a lot, and I have such an appreciation for all of the ways that we as U.S. citizens can try to influence policy, where in Honduras and Guatemala, it's very difficult for people to influence their own governments. So I would say, especially for those of you who are in high school, the best thing you can do is get involved and learn your history, right? Learn your history, study this issue, try to find out as much as you can. I'll be sending along a resource packet. And what we can do to change things is something as simple as supporting a weaving cooperative in Guatemala. They sell beautiful pencil case holders like this, laptop bags, scarves, right? You can look for organizations that support nutrition programs and offer to volunteer or to give time. You can go work on the border or support organizations that leave water for people crossing the desert. And in terms of policy, it's very important just to read up on how the US has acted in the region over the last 60 or 70 years, and then get in touch with advocacy organizations in the States that lobby Congress. There are wonderful organizations like the Guatemalan Human Rights Office that lobbies Congress in Washington, D.C. So plenty of ways to get involved, either by supporting organizations on the ground in Guatemala or by supporting organizations in the States and volunteering for organizations who do lobbying. Always, of course, contacting your local representatives, and of course, always voting and knowing what your local candidates say on these issues. What organizations do I work for as a journalist? Entre Mundos is one. That's a small human rights magazine, as well as Nomala.gt. I'll send that link along. It's the leading digital native news outlet in Guatemala. I also translate for Amnesty International and several other really great news organizations. Another option in the States is to support organizations that do legal work in detention centers and represent people who are asking for asylum. I translate once in a while in detention centers in Virginia with the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Organization, which is a legal organization of some really motivated lawyers. There are lots of local organizations that do that. So I also see, could you talk a little bit more about the genocide in Guatemala? That's a topic, again, that deserves its own in-depth discussion. But in a nutshell, it's representative of how the United States tends to oppose reformist governments and support status quo governments that are not interested in helping most of their population. Guatemala's 36-year civil war only ended in 1996 and shaped the country to the present day. And it was sparked in large part, because 10 years of successful reformist democracy modeled on the US was terminated by a US intervention. So the United States decided to overthrow the Guatemalan government in 1954. Military dictatorships were installed and people rebelled. And that sparked 36 years of civil war that crescendoed in a genocide of Maya people. Now that's a very complicated topic, and I will send along information in the resource packet about just that. But this history is certainly something to keep in mind and is important context for the present, because the same patterns continue to happen. In Honduras, that cowboy at the bottom of the screen was doing pretty well in reducing poverty. The Honduran military kidnapped him from the presidential palace, exiled him from the country, and the regimes that have followed have been a disaster. The current president is seen as a thug and a dictator in Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez on the top right. He faces massive protests perennially. It's very dangerous to be a journalist or an activist, a land rights activist in Honduras. People die every month, journalists and activists. And this president's own brother is serving 20 years in U.S. federal prison for being a narco, for being a drug trafficker. So this guy is no picnic, and yet he is a U.S. ally because he cooperates on other policy fronts. So this context is very important. It's very important to have an appreciation for the political situation. My resource packet will absolutely include ways to plug in and get involved. I'm going to take my time to put it together. I'm going to make sure it's comprehensive. And when I send it out, I will welcome any further questions. I suppose finally, this is the last question I see. What do I hope increasing visibility about these issues will accomplish? As I said, living in Guatemala and Honduras and other places, it's given me an appreciation for the power that we have as American citizens to change the direction of our own governments. So I think that positive change in the United States starts with informed people, motivated people who are ready to try to make change. So I hope that raising awareness about what's happening, about the situation, will help us develop more humane policies and will help us feel connected to people in Guatemala and Honduras, and will build connections between organizations that are doing great work and communities in the States that are willing to fundraise. So that's part of what I hope in the long term can come out of this kind of reporting. Thank you very much. I don't see any new questions. Again, I will send out that resource packet over the next few days, and I will be sure to include ways to get involved. And I will be sure also to leave my information there so that you will be able to ask any further questions. We had lots of people on. Thank you so much. And we will be in touch.